Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a laser-focused quick-fire interview on food and the economy with international experts, where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. These are difficult times, and I am Ajay Jakhar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India, as well as the Vice Chair of Action Track 2, Shift to Sustainable Consumption Patterns at the UN FoodSystems Summit. Today, we are delighted to have Michael Fakhri, who is a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law with us. He is also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, known for leading dialogues on human rights and development with peasant organizations, labor unions, and human rights activists, and at international organizations and conferences. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Thank you, Ajay. It's a pleasure to be here.
You started your career in corporate law, but now research and teach food development, commercial and human rights law. How do you become interested in these topics? Did your experience as an immigrant from Lebanon influence your career interests in advocacy?
Yeah, so I started, as you said, my career as a corporate lawyer for two reasons. One, the very practical reason of I had student debt and I needed a good job, and corporate law pays well, and there's no harm in trying to pay off your debt. But also, I was really trying to understand how the corporate sector worked. And I really felt at the time, if our lives are increasingly dominated by corporations and by the corporate sector, I really felt as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer, to try and bring that change from within the system, to understand it, and to meet people where they are. But quickly, I realized that the limitations of working within corporate law itself. And so I went back to graduate school and did my PhD. And when trying to think of a topic for my PhD, I tried to think of a topic that would connect to all types of people, all sort of everyday life. And that I was passionate about, because a PhD is long and difficult and a lonely process. And I felt responsible. If someone asked me, what's your PhD on? I'm not going to say theories of imperialism and capitalism. I'm going to say something real: food. And so food it's everything. It's our relationships with each other. It's our relationship with the environment. And to your point about being an immigrant, like many Lebanese families, we migrated my entire life. And I think when you leave home, the first thing you miss is food. The first thing you try to always reconnect with and you remember home, and your sense of who you are often is food. And it probably played a role. I was probably homesick during my PhD when I was thinking about food. So I think that played a big role.
You were appointed the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food in the March 2020 and took charge of your role in the midst of a global pandemic. Were you shocked at the unpreparedness of governments and of the response of leaderships across the world to the crisis? I mean, if we could have some reflections in your learnings from.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I was shocked. I think everything happened so quickly. I didn't have time to judge the governments. I think I was upset at how poor some of the responses were. But to your question, I was also surprised at some things that did work. So what I think was really unfortunate and just revealed, I think, the limitations of government's sense of how to take care of people is how workers in the food sectors, all across food and agricultural sectors, were poorly treated. So whether it was in the shops, whether it's in public markets, whether it's in the fields or the kitchens, or anywhere that it's part of our food system, the governments treated people, they knew they were essential, but they treated them like they were expendable. So for example, agricultural workers that work on farms and in the fields, were the least protected. They were working under incredibly unsafe conditions. People in the shops or in supermarkets were on the front line. They were forced to work, but without increased pay or increased protection or adjustments. And we saw, for example, in Europe and North America, meat packing plants became vectors of COVID. So not only were the workers getting sick, they're working shoulder to shoulder, but they were making the communities around them sick. And this, for me, was such a blatant ignoring of people's well-being, right? So that was really, I think, upsetting. The fact that governments are not coming together to respond to the hunger crisis and the food crisis multilaterally, everyone is really trying to deal with it on their own, and it's turning into geopolitics. That's unfortunate. And I'm part of different groups that are trying to bring governments and people together. But what did work, what's interesting is also how some schools responded. I think what people learned is that schools are not just institutions where we send our children for an education, they're institutions of care. It's where people take care of our children. And so in some countries, and the United Kingdom is a great example, they closed their schools and children went hungry. But in other places, schools stayed open throughout the academic year, through the summer and the winter and the fall, regardless of the academic calendar. And they continue to offer families free meals, right? So this happened. I was lucky in my community. I live in Oregon in the United States. Our school district would just stand in front of the schools and hand out to anyone who came by. So I saw great examples of communities coming together and finding ways of feeding each other.
Those are inspiring stories. Now, this is an important question for us. In January of this year, you wrote an open letter to Agnes Kalibata, the special envoy of the UN Secretary General for the Food Systems Summit. You expressed concerns that the summit did not center human rights and agroecological approaches and excluded forms of indigenous traditional knowledge. You also drew attention to the marginalization of civil society mechanisms of the Committee on World Food Security in the summit process. The summit ends this month. Have your concerns been addressed? If yes or no, what are the reasons thereof?
Yeah. Unfortunately, my concerns from a year ago were not addressed. And let me explain what position I'm in sort of, where I'm speaking from. When I wrote to Dr. Kalibata in her capacity as the Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Food Systems Summit, I was writing as someone who was invited by her and the Food Systems Secretariat to be a member of what's called the integrating team of the Food Systems Summit. This was the leadership team that met at least approximately once a month over the past year. All the major decision makers and people that were in, so the chairs of the action tracks, the chair of the champions group, amongst others, we would meet. And this was the group that provided the vision to make the summit coherent and to make it serve the people and provide real solutions for governments and everybody really in the Food Systems Summit. So that letter was my opening letter of what I saw some of the shortcomings at the front end, but I also offered my advice and potential solutions and ways to move forward. And I continued in that role. But it wasn't just me. I was also reflecting what I was hearing. As UN Special Rapporteur, I'm an independent expert. So it's my job to listen to people, to listen to governments, to the private sector, and to reflect back publicly what I've been learning and what I've been hearing. My job is also to bear witness in terms of how people are struggling in the midst of the pandemic. The biggest shortcoming, separate from the policy concepts and the issue of human rights, which remains on the margins of the Food Systems Summit, is the summit doesn't address COVID in any real way. So all the solutions and proposals that are coming out of the summit assume that COVID has been solved, where the reality of every people's life is they need solutions today in the reality of today, which is the pandemic, which will last for a long time. So I've pushed amongst many people within the summit process. Some protested from outside of the process, and that I respect that. That was made sense because human rights was marginalized. And I gave it my best effort, but many others within the summit structure also gave it their best effort. The pre-summit about a month ago was, I think, a culminating moment. Human rights was one 50-minute panel. It was very poorly organized, unfortunately. And now with the summit up ahead, I don't see any change. I think the pre-summit and the way the summit has been structured has left many people cynical, unfortunately. It's left many member states frustrated and confused. And now I think it's important to shift the conversation. The summit is an event. It will happen and it will end. But what's more important is we're here, we have institutions, we have relationships. So I encourage everyone to take their energy, to take the spirit and energy of human rights that so many people, thousands of people brought to the summit and go. There is a mechanism. So the Committee on World Food Security is a place for governments to go, but most importantly, it's a place for people to go. There's something called the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, and it is autonomous. It's where people, farmers, fishers, pastoralists, advocacy groups represent themselves. They overcome their own differences as people, not, we all have our own position, and they find solidarity and hold governments accountable in a UN multilateral forum. So that's where I would encourage people to go to direct all this energy that they put into the summit.
Thank you for that advice of where to go after the summit ends, which gets us to the next question. What is your opinion on the counter mobilizations by many organizations, like the peasant movements such as La Via Campesina? Can you tell us about any social movements, activism, or research that inspires and gives you hope for a better future?
What a wonderful question on sort of that notion of hope. And I agree, what implicit in the question is that hope can be found in popular activism, in grassroots activism. So as you pointed, La Via Campesina, also the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty, over 500 organizations representing millions of people all over the world decided to boycott the summit because the summit in the beginning didn't even have human rights on the agenda. And then when it did, it was on the margins and treated human rights just as a choice amongst several other choices. And they also boycotted the summit because it didn't explicitly say, what's the problem with our food systems in the first place? And the problem is that power is still in the hands of a small number of transnational corporations. The power is not in the hands of the people that actually feed us: the farmers, the peasants, the fishers, the pastoralists, women, and indigenous people. And so, they met with the Deputy Secretary General. There were multiple attempts to try and reconcile the counter mobilization and the Food Systems Summit Secretariat and the Deputy Secretary General. And in the end, they did not find common ground. And I was privy to those conversations. And what I saw in the end is the Food Systems Summit Secretariat was not listening, actively listening to what the people were demanding and requiring to participate in a meaningful way. One last point, what is unfortunate is there is a history, there is precedence of civil society participating in UN food conferences. The last big conference in 1996, the World Food Conference, had a space, an autonomous space for civil society. So there's no reason why we don't continue that trend, why it turned into a step backwards. So as someone who participated within the process, I understood and respected those that were pushing from outside, and it was effective. It forced people within the summit to listen and to realize they needed to do better. As a result, there were some victories. Agroecology was put on the agenda, despite many people within the Food Systems Summit Secretariat resisted this idea. Human rights was forced onto the agenda, even though it wasn't in the beginning. I think it's because we had people passionate on the inside and people passionate on the outside working in parallel.
I can agree with you about people being passionate on the inside, because I have been there and it's been a struggle to get issues like power imbalances, consolidation in food value chains on top of the table, but work goes on. In a recent podcast, you spoke about how the right to food transcends the paradigms of food security and charity to encompass food sovereignty and dignity. Given the entrenched nature of power imbalances of businesses and national interests, how can these principles be incorporated in commercial and trade laws relating to food, which add to climate change and equity, equality asymmetries?
Yeah, we could spend hours on that one, Ajay. You really hit the heart of the matter there. This is a question I'm going to continue investigating in my capacity of UN Special Rapporteur, and I've also addressed it in my reports. Just very quickly on trade, I think the World Trade Organization is now at a point of fundamental transformation, but it's unclear in what direction. And I think previously you couldn't talk about food security within the WTO. That has now changed. Now this is a new moment. And I think, as I said previously, my understanding of how I think change happens is from new relationships and new alliances. And I think the right to food as inspired and defined by food sovereignty movements, is that way of bringing new people together to articulate their needs and their interests in the language of the right to food. Because the right to food is not like, human rights can be used in good and bad ways, but social movements and the food sovereignty movement has given a specific meaning to the right to food that starts with the question of power imbalances, that starts with the question of how to redistribute power on a global scale. So I see hope in new alliances, for example, new alliances between workers and farmers. This doesn't always happen, and workers and farmers don't always get along. But in many countries, and I know to what audience I'm speaking to today, the new alliances between workers and farmers is inspiring on a global scale.
Thank you so much for answering our questions. And I think I would want to thank you on behalf of the producers that I represent for the inspiring work that you are doing, and hope to be working with you on some projects, on some issues as time goes on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ajay. It's been a pleasure, and I'm a big fan of this series, so it's just been an honor to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.